I'm Ed Rabyd, otherwise known as the Rabyd Atheist, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like. The purpose of this channel is educational in regards to atheist and deconversion issues and Bible, theology, politics, philosophy, and anything else that comes up in relationship to those issues. Today I want to do a little bit of commentary on the idea of whether or not God is pro-life or pro-death. And if the title of the video is indication, it is God is pro-death. Now, the pro-life position has always been that life begins at conception and that each person should be preserved because they're a special creation of God, that God absolutely cares about every individual that he has ever knit together in their mother's womb, and that he absolutely cares about each individual as they come alive, watch all their life, and he always has. You see, because many of the pro-life positions, particularly these ideas, I just quoted the knit together in mother's womb. That comes from the Old Testament. This idea of the preservation of life is key to the pro-life position, and that the reason it is so is God has declared life as sacred, and that he preserves life from the moment that you are conceived as a person. I want to challenge that notion because, quite frankly, when I look at the person that is most responsible for child death, and for literally unborn child death, it's God himself, at least in the Bible. Now, I want to preface this by saying that I don't believe that many of these stories are even true. But as part of the fictional narrative of who God is, of Yahweh God, and later on in both the Old and New Testaments, we have a God who is, quite frankly, more pro-death than he is anything else, including with both infants and young unborn children. Now, I'm going to offer up 6 examples of this. I could use many more, but these are probably the most famous and most common examples of how God is pro-death. The first being Noah's flood. Now, like it or not, no matter what justification you want to give for God destroying the earth with a flood, using Noah as the only people that survive, the fact of the matter is that in such a flood that destroyed all of humanity, there would have been A, pregnant women, B, infants, a lot of children, and a lot of innocents. Now, I know the text says that everybody thought evil all the time. Really, an unborn child thought evil all the time? Now you're probably saying, well, maybe God caused it so unborn children weren't born for a few years, so that way there wouldn't be any. But that doesn't make any sense given the words of Jesus, who basically seems to indicate that business was usual. They were marrying, giving in marriage, eating and drinking, doing the things that they were doing until destruction came upon them. Paraphrasing from Jesus's words. If that's the case, then we would have to assume that there were pregnant women, that there were also young children, small kids. I'm sorry, the 2 unbelievable parts of the story is A, that everybody thought evil all the time, because I don't think it's even mentally or physically possible to do so. But also, to say that God is pro-life when he literally drowns to death pregnant women that have unborn children in their wombs. The idea at this point that God is somehow inherently pro-life, I don't think so. He seems to be probably one of the biggest propagators of infants killing. And this story just starts and begins to open it. The other idea is child sacrifice. In particular, we have the first child sacrifice with Abraham. I know that a lot of you have gotten on my things with and tried to defend Abraham's rationale, and I'll tell you this and I'll tell you again, child sacrifice is an irrational act that is not justified. It is never justified. But when we look at the whole story of Abraham, the real problem with it is God is literally ordering Abraham to kill his child, to kill this precious child who had nothing to do with this test or anything about it. And then all of a sudden, all of a sudden God is asking him to kill the child of promise. And a lot of people have tried to justify, well, if you had been through what Abraham went through, that would make it understandable why he would want to do that. I don't give a shit about Abraham in this story. I care about God's attitude toward Isaac's life. Basically, God is okay with putting a young man and his father to an essentially what amounts to a tremendous emotionally distressive event, all for the purpose of proving a point. If human beings did such things, we would call them, well, mentally deranged, psychopaths. But God does it and gets away with it. I don't care in this story so much about Abraham. As I really begin to look at God's character in this, he doesn't have a problem with killing children, and that would include by extension anybody else who wants to prove their faith. He doesn't have a problem with you looking at your child and think, if God asks for this child, I have to offer him up. I have to kill them because God asks and I must be obedient to God. That's not very pro-life. That's putting a condition on the fact that you're willing to kill your child under certain circumstances, most notably to prove your faith. Because if you're going to follow Abraham's example and be a hero of the faith, as it says in Hebrews 11, you're going to have to do what he did if God were to call and ask you to do so. The other one that I want to talk about, and this one's a little bit more controversial, is the Adultery Test in Numbers chapter 5, where a man who feels that his wife has been unfaithful, and he says he calls her in front of the priest. There's a whole bunch of ceremonial stuff that goes on. And really, the priest kind of casts a magic spell. Now, what this amounts to, at least when I read the passage, is kind of like a morning after pill. It's kind of like if she's pregnant and her vow, the spirit of her vow, coupled with the purity of the holy water or whatever the hell else they're using in that passage, if she drinks that, it will cause her abdominal to swell. It'll cause her sexual member to shrink. She won't be able to have kids. And that would include immediately if she was indeed unfaithful and pregnant at the time. If this little thing went about the way it was supposed to, she wouldn't be able to give birth to the child that's in her womb. It may even kill it. And that's kind of interesting considering the pro-life position. Now, this one's a little bit rougher and it's kind of iffy, but from my own standpoint of interpretation, it seems to me that God has little concern, regardless of whether or not the woman is even pregnant. If she is, well, whatever. But apparently, we're going to kill the baby in the process. Because even if they were found by more conventional means that she was indeed an adulteress, she'd be stoned immediately. There's really no provision in the law that says you're going to wait until the baby's born because it's innocent and then kill the woman. No, that child is the product of adultery and so therefore just as evil as the mother in some mentalities. Sorry, it seems to be very plain to me that God isn't very pro-life and not really treating that child as a special creation of God. And quite frankly, he has no concern about the fact that that particular child would die. Another thing that kind of proves that God isn't really all that pro-life and actually more pro-death is his constant demanding of his people of genocide. Particularly in Numbers 31, the slaughter of the Medianites is particularly famous. A lot of atheists use this. I'm going to use it too in this particular case because the statement of pro-life is that, unborn children, young children, everybody that's a child that's an innocent should be protected and cared for because God creates each person special and he protects them. Not for the Medianites. Moses gets pissed off. He gets pissed off because they left him too many people alive. They spared the women and the children. And this pissed off Moses because he said, no, you're not supposed to do that. When many of the stories are recounted in Deuteronomy for another generation of people, it's pointed out that they slaughtered everybody, including the little ones. I think that's in Deuteronomy 2. But you need to understand at this point that when we look at the Medianites here, God tells them to slaughter everybody except for virgin girls. This would mean every pregnant woman, every woman that's had sex, every male child, baby, on up, killed at the command of God. Don't tell me that God is pro-life when he literally performs the same effect as an abortion on all of these children. All of them had to die. I'm not even going to get into what the virgin girls were going to be used for later, but the fact of the matter is they just straight up became sex slaves, concubines to the conquerors. And you need to think about how awful that would have been, to watch your whole family get slaughtered by people and then find yourself repeatedly raped night after night as a sex slave to the very people that killed your entire family. Golly, God is such a piece of shit. And the fact that he is such pro-death and wants to kill so many people just because they don't worship him and just because they don't bow down to him. What an egotist. You know, he just has his head up his own ass, and everybody else that doesn't agree with him has to die. Another one that I've always found problematic is Jephthah's daughter in Judges chapter 11. Here's a man who goes out, fights the Amalekites, I believe, beats them, and makes a vow, God, if you give me victory, then I will offer up as a burnt offering the first thing that comes out of my home to greet me. So he gets out there, he fights them, he beats them, he comes home, and the first thing to come out and greet him is his one and only daughter, who is unmarried, who still has her virginity intact, according to the story. And Jephthah wails because he has to keep his vow. And so she goes off, she bewails her virginity for a couple months, comebacks, and the text deliberately says, and Jephthah did as he was directed by his vow. I want you to understand what that involves. A burnt offering has to be slaughtered before the altar of the maker. Whoever makes the altar has to slaughter that person. Jephthah's daughter would have been stripped naked. She would have been told to kneel. She would have had her head pulled back to reveal her throat. Her own father would have slit her throat. He then would have cut her into pieces and burnt after removing the entrails out of her, and he would have burned her as a burnt sacrifice to God. God's pro-life? Really? That he's so, the suspicious thing about God in this story is he's completely absent. He doesn't come up and say, oh, no, her life is precious, and just because you made a rash vow, I'm not going to hold you to that. Oh, hell no. It seems that God, by his silence, allows her to do this. I sincerely hope that this is not based on a true fucking story, because that would be truly horrendous to me. I can't even imagine doing such a thing to my daughter. And I don't think any decent human being with any kind of empathy would say, yeah, he has said some pretty rash words. Wouldn't you rather have your daughter stay alive and suffer some sort of curse from God? I'm sorry, I would have taken that chance, even as a theist. But the fact is, the whole story smacks of, I don't give a shit about children. What is important to me as God is that you keep your vow, and you keep your vow no matter what it causes you to sacrifice, even your only daughter. Don't talk to me about God being pro-life. In this particular case, it couldn't be clearer that he cares more about his ego being stroked than the life of a girl. Then, of course, we also have David's child, the child that was born to him in Bathsheba. A child that lasts 7 days, not long enough to be named, not long enough to be circumcised. And then the child dies. What did this child do to anybody? By my belief, he's alive and should be protected. But God basically gives the child a disease and causes it to die. Really, God cares about the innocent. God defends the innocent. God cares about the unborn child and the infant and the small child. Really, how is this so? I'm sorry, I feel that theists at this point are hard-pressed, and I've only used 6 examples to demonstrate this, of how God is pro-death, not pro-life. Now, because of your patience, I'm going to give you one more bonus one. And this one also is a little bit more theological in speaking. Why does God seem to have no problem allowing David's child to die, who was nothing but an innocent, allowing Jephthah's daughter to be slaughtered by her father, allowing Abraham to go to possibly killing his son, allowing his own people to slaughter the Medianites, including little ones, as the text says? Why does he have no problem with an adultery test that would cause an unborn child to die if it came to fruition? Why does he have no problem with the drowning of pregnant women and children? Why? Because he's setting up the greatest one of all, that he doesn't even give a shit enough about his own son not to slaughter him. I hate to say it, but you don't get off on this one because of the New Testament. And that is simply this. God sees as the only plan, a plan of redemption that he could do any way he chooses. He's the one that makes the rules. He's the one that says this is the thing. Now, you either have to conclude that there are certain rules that are above God that even have to order God's behavior, or you have to conclude that despite his sovereignty, God chooses a plan that involves the slaughter of his own child. I've demonstrated throughout this thing that God really doesn't have 2 cares about anybody's children, and that would be bad enough. But he doesn't give a shit about his own either, especially when you consider the fact that God could have done this any way he chose. Quite literally, he could just have forgiven everybody. Guys, you just keep fucking up, but you know what? I'm going to let it go because you're human, you make mistakes. And I should really work on, as God, being a little bit more persuasive and maybe show myself every once in a while to prove that I exist. And that way, you can see that I exist, and then you'll believe. Oh, but no. We're going to send his son. We're not going to have anybody see it. In fact, we're going to bless people for not having seen and yet have believed. And how are we going to accomplish this great miracle? By sending our only begotten son to die on a cross, being sacrificed so that I can appease myself by slaughtering myself, to forgive people that if I just chose to forgive them, I wouldn't have to destroy them. You see, God isn't pro-life. There is a thread throughout the Bible of God slaughtering innocents, slaughtering children, making pregnant women die, all the way through the whole thing. And somehow, you theists out there will find a way to justify it. And I'm going to speak of a deconversion issue. I know this video is probably going to upset one, but sometimes you have to get in people's faces about things. And this is one of the things that's been bothering me for a while. I put off making this video for about 3 weeks, but I now really have to do it. But you really have to hand it to you. This is a deconversion issue to me because I look at you now. Because I used to look at all these stories that I've outlined, and I would have to find reasons why they made sense. And then I discovered, you know what? This is the biggest proof of God's non-existence, and that all of these stories are probably written by some mad king trying to justify his genocidal and homicidal behaviors. If, after all, God does it, so can I. And there's really a political motivation behind all this. Every sacrifice acceptable, including your own children, to the king. And that includes me. I mean, if God gets away with it, I should be included to that as his representative on earth of authority. I'm thinking that's exactly what happened. And all of you are going to run to your little programs and you're going to pull out verses and you're going to tell me I don't know what I'm talking about. And you're going to really try to find some flaw or hole, but you still have to deal with the fact that you serve a God that will demand of you sacrifice your child, because he sacrificed his own after all. And many others throughout history have faced the same test and had to give up their kids or slaughter other people's kids in order to prove their dedication and faith to God. You're going to have to try to find a way to justify that. I don't have to do that anymore. As an atheist, I can look at these stories and say, wow, what a fucking bunch of horrendous pieces of crap these stories are. In all of literature, as Dan Barker says, God must be the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. He's an absolute asshole, and you guys try to defend him. I don't have to do that anymore. I don't have to become some apologist for an obvious work of mythology. And some of the biggest things that prove it is that God is really, 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 really pro-death, not pro-life. That, of course, brings me back to the pro-life movement. I think there's some good arguments to be made, even from an atheist point of view, why life should be considered. But at the same time, as somebody who supports the pro-choice position, I don't support it because I think abortion is a good thing. I support it because I don't have the right to make a decision for another person when it's their choice to make, because it affects their body and their life. Recently, Texas has passed one of the most insidious anti-abortion bills I've ever heard of. Basically, a heartbeat bill that says if there's a heartbeat, you can't kill it. You can't kill the fetus. Most women don't even know they're pregnant at 6 weeks. It has got to be one of the most horrendous things I have seen the United States do in a long time. It's already incredibly difficult, usually, to get an abortion in the Deep South and the Bible Belt in particular, because those state governments get rid of this. And they all justify it using their religion, no matter how much they try to couch it in political terms. This is a religious doctrine that somehow God knits everybody into their mother's womb and is special and does all these things. And every life is sacred to God. Tell that to the pregnant mother that was drowned by the flood. Tell that to the woman who had an affair and suddenly finds the child growing in her womb destroyed by an adultery test. Tell that to Isaac as he stared down a knife by the order of God that would demand his death, and had his father not followed through, or perhaps not even done it, he might have found himself dead anyway. Tell it to the Medianite little girl who's a virgin, who watched her little brothers get slaughtered and her mother, who was pregnant, get slaughtered, and finds herself a sexual object for the rest of her life after of somebody who actually literally slaughtered her family. Tell that to Jephthah's daughter, that God is pro-life, as the lifeblood of her bled down her neck and across her body, as she was slaughtered and offered up as a burnt offering to satisfy a vow to a God who didn't even show up in the story to say, hey, no, you shouldn't do that. Tell that to the infant babe of David and Bathsheba, who died after 7 days and found himself dead, merely for the purpose of God making a point to a king. Don't tell me that the God of the Bible cares 2 shits about life, ultimately culminating in one other thing, that he was willing to slaughter his only begotten son for some plan of redemption that is completely unnecessary, and you're fully capable of getting around it some other way as God, because you're omnipotent, you're omniscient, and you're all-loving. You could have found a way to do it differently. You could literally just forgive everybody, because that's the way it should be, because you say you desire everybody to come to a knowledge of the truth in 1 Timothy 2:4, and then you turn right around and don't really come up with a plan that'll do that. I want to thank everybody for stopping by. I appreciate you coming by. I know this has been probably a little bit more of a heavy-duty video, but it's been on my mind for quite some time, and it's something that I've heard people say that, you know, there's pro-life whatever, and I just don't see it in the biblical God. He's not pro-life, he's pro-death. And, thank you for being here and listening to me pontificate. And I appreciate all of that. I also appreciate recently the subscribers growing as much as they have. At present, I've grown 100 subscribers in the last 28 days. I'm getting very close to that 250, and if I break 250, I'll mark that in the video that I release after that. And this time I will indeed open up my PayPal account and open up my Patreon account and get that going so I can find some way to finance this effort so I can spend a little bit more time for it and justify it for those reasons. Thank you once again for stopping by, and I appreciate you all being here. So make sure you like, share, subscribe. Everything you do helps the channel. You can also follow me on Facebook. It's a great way to get announcements about the channel. It's a great way to get the videos if your Facebook is your platform. I even post a couple of memes from time to time if you're interested in that. And I just thank you once again for stopping by, and hopefully I can convince you to be a rabid atheist like myself. In the meantime, this is Ed Rabyd, also known as the Rabid Atheist, signing off and wishing you a good day.